Welcome to Books in Five. My name is Pavan. I'm your host, and we're talking to credible authors of recently published books on relevant topics. Today we have Richard Holden here with us, all the way from Australia. Hi, Richard. How are you?
Hi, I'm great to be with you.
I'm so grateful that you're here with us because you've just written an amazing new book. I have it up here, Money in the 21st Century. And let's get right into it. We're going to be asking you five questions. We'll give you 5 minutes to answer each one. We're going to try to stick on that deadline and let's get started. So for our
Sure.
first question, money has been a defining feature of human societies for millennia now, but you write about the fundamental transformations taking place in the present day. Can you help us understand what exactly these forces are that are changing money, how it is used, and who controls it?
Absolutely. So yeah, that's kind of a central stepping off point for the book. At least two things are happening, really three. So one is money has become mobile. So we often pay now, or at least many people in countries with advanced payment systems pay with either tap cards or with a device like a phone or even a watch or a ring, rather than paying with, physical cash, banknotes and coins and stuff. So money's become mobile. That has a whole lot of advantages as well as implications and challenges for transitions for different elements of society, like older people and younger people, for instance. Of course, money's become digital in some instances, and I'm referring here to cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ether, and others. Now, they're still not used very much for transactions because the transaction costs of using them are very high, but they hold a lot of promise in a couple of ways, some good, some not so good. So I think in the good category is something like Ether running on the Ethereum blockchain holds out the promise of smart contracts and programmable money and decentralized autonomous organizations. They're all part of what's become known as Web3.
Yeah, Web3, which is a topic that's been in the news and it's been prominent all over social media over the past few years, right? Yeah.
Exactly. That holds out the promise of that. I don't think that promise has come through, and I talk about in the book how maybe we can get there. And then there's the not so good, which is, of course, these cryptocurrencies can be used for illicit activities like human trafficking and trading in illicit goods like fentanyl and stuff like that, because they're anonymous, and so that's in the not so good category. And then the last major force I talk about in the book is cheap money. Now interest rates have gone up a bit since I started on this project, although they're sort of on their way down again. We saw from the start of the 2008 financial crisis, the US Federal Reserve cut interest rates to literally zero in December 2008, and they stayed there until December 2015, zero. And they've gone up to deal with the inflationary surge out of the pandemic. But I think most people believe that interest rates are kind of steady state interest rates for a country like the US, probably somewhere around 3%, 2.5%, maybe something like that. And if that's the case, then we're in an era of kind of permanently much cheaper money than was historically the case. And that has implications for things like asset bubbles, the effect on developing economies, and other things that I talk about.
Yeah, and you know what? The last little bit of this first question is, who controls this? Who controls this transformation of what has taken place in money and currencies and finance?
Yeah, well, right now, governments control money. They issue fiat currency and they have control over it. If cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin were to become dominant, then governments would lose control over money, and that would have very serious implications for their ability to set interest rates, to levy taxes, and various other things. So there's a battle going on for the control of money. That's between kind of private money and government money. And then there's a battle between governments. There's a race between China and whoever else is willing to get in that race for basically developing the world's first widespread central bank digital currency. And China's made huge leaps and progress in rolling that out. The US hasn't gone anywhere. Europe's made some early steps. And so I talk at length.
I'm going to cut you off quickly because we only have 60 seconds left for this first question because what you just brought up, we're going to get really deep into that in
Right.
a little bit. But for this last, little bit that we have for this first question is, I know you brought it up earlier in terms of how this new type of money is used, but I'm hoping you can delve a little bit more deeply into that.
Yeah, well, the new type of money, do you mean crypto or do you mean kind of mobile money?
Both.
Okay. Well, crypto can be used for, as I say, good things and bad things. I think the exciting stuff is things like programmable money and smart contracts, self-executing contracts, which is really behind the promise of DeFi or decentralized finance. And I think mobile money just makes everything more efficient. It means it's just quicker and easier to transact. And it also means that you can cut out kind of the illicit market where people are dodging taxes and things like that.
Got it, got it. So let's move on to our second question here, which is, you're considered one of the world's foremost thought leaders and experts on this subject. So, how did you get interested in money and how has your thinking changed? And, we got a substantive amount of time here, right? Like, I want to really get into your mind. How did you want to, or why did you even want to explore this topic?
I came at it from two aspects. So I got interested in the mobile part of money because Australia has a very advanced payment system. We had tap card technology among the first countries in the world, if not maybe the first country in the world to have really widespread tap card technology. So at a time when I would travel back to the United States to present my research and work with co-authors and would constantly be sort of swiping a card and, maybe signing a piece of paper and stuff in Australia. I was never doing that. And that was in the, say the early twins or something like that. And so then I got thinking about what that would mean for our ability to get rid of cash in Australia. And I did some work thinking about what the cost to the economy from tax evasion of that was. And I started writing about that in the popular press. I have a newspaper column here, and I wrote about that and got some positive feedback and some incredibly angry negative feedback about why people really like cash, and people saying things about how if their wife found out what they were spending their money on, they'd get divorced. And it was all, I was going to wreak havoc with things. And then the pandemic happened, and it seems, a lot of places just stopped taking cash for kind of public health and other reasons.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
that got,
you have a chapter in your book titled "The Year That Changed Everything," right?
yeah, exactly. So I got thinking about it from that angle, and then from the sort of academic aspect. I cut my teeth on an area of economics called contract theory, which is kind of like game theory, but where you get to design the rules of the game and try and achieve certain outcomes with, contracts, which are basically like game forms. And,
Hmm.
contracts can be what you think of as a legal contract. Contracts can be sort of mechanisms and other game forms. And that got me into thinking about cryptocurrency and the anonymity of it. And I wrote a whole series of research papers around various different aspects of blockchain and cryptocurrency. And I just got interested in that. And then I kind of thought, well, I got these two strands. And at the same time, I've been writing in my column about low interest rates and all that kind of stuff. And having kind of those three different ingredients sitting in front of me, I said, I think there's a common thread among these things, and let's see if I can write that up in an accessible form for a general audience, because these things are a little impenetrable, and I'm not the first person to write about blockchain by any means, but I like to think that I've drawn these threads together in a way that's accessible to a general audience.
I would definitely agree with that. And, we have maybe about 30 more seconds here. I just wanted to finalize this question, which is, how has your thinking changed?
I think I've become more hardened in my view that governments need to take the lead if we're going to get Web3, and that the transaction cost problem is pretty hard. And so I really think that governments are going to need to develop their own central bank digital currency.
And I know you push for that in your book, but let's move on to our third question over here, which is, the book showcases three very prominent figures in the world of finance, technology, and policy. Can you talk about who they are, their impact, and why you chose to highlight them?
Sure. So my first one is Vitalik Buterin, who's the founder of Ethereum. He founded that when he was a teenager. And Vitalik had the
Fellow
great
Canadian, yeah, he's a fellow
fellow
Canadian.
Canadian indeed. And Vitalik had the very, very good idea to put a Turing complete programming language on top of a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. So Bitcoin obviously already existed when Vitalik came along, but he had the insight that if you want to really do something expansive with that, you want it to be programmable. So you need a programming language on top of it. And that's what the Ethereum blockchain is. And I guess so he's had an enormous impact on the crypto world, and I think also on my thinking. And on top of that, Satoshi Nakamoto, who invented or wrote the white paper for and kind of invented Bitcoin, is a pseudonym, and we don't know who that person's is or are. And so in a sense, Vitalik is kind of the public face of the
Yeah,
crypto.
he's the figurehead. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and continues to play an important role. So it's natural to focus on him. Second person I focus on is Janet Yellen, who at the time that I wrote the book, and indeed until about 55 days ago, was Treasury Secretary of the United States. And my book starts with a meeting that was widely reported on in the press, but I sort of go into it a little bit more, I guess. Between her and the chair of the Federal Reserve, the job she had before being Treasury Secretary, Jay Powell, in her office, where Meta, Facebook, as it then was, are trying to get a trial for their private digital currency.
And what was the name of that again?
It went by a couple of names. It was, at the time, it was known as Libra.
Libra,
And
yeah, Libra.
and Powell is kind of like, what harm can it do? It's just a trial. And Yellen's queasy about this and understands, Powell understands this too, but she puts a lot of emphasis on the idea of there being potential for network externalities, and this could get the kind of flywheel going. And maybe a trial isn't a trial. It's actually like becomes an endpoint, a bit like, if you trial Uber, it becomes a thing. If you trial Amazon, it becomes a thing because of these network externalities.
And Facebook is known for moving fast and breaking things, right?
Yeah, they're proud of the fact that they break things so while they get going. So she sort of says no. So she's very important in that. And, in another sense, this is a book that I hope to have a wide and general interest audience. But another way of thinking about it is, she was the audience of one. I was trying to make the point that the US needs to get this FedCoin thing, as I call it, going. The third figure in the book is Raghu Rajan, who I had the great good fortune of being a colleague of for 3 years when I was at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He was there, he still is there. He also served as chief economic advisor to the Prime Minister of India and as governor of the Indian Central Bank. And Raghu's an incredibly broad thinker, incredibly impressive person, from academic economist to policymaker. But what I emphasize of his many good thoughts in the book is he really talked about the impact of cheap money, low interest rates in the United States and other OECD economies on countries like India and what it can do to their economies. And at the same time, he wasn't responsible for this, but he was, in high office in India when Prime Minister Modi took a bunch of large banknotes out of circulation, became known as demonetization.
And that was a very dramatic episode in India's history over the past decade, right? Yeah.
Yeah, dramatic.
You write about it in your book.
Yeah, and not so good. So I kind of present that as an example of what not to do if you're going to transition to a cashless society.
Did you get a chance to reach out to all three of them, or try to, get some quotes for your book? Or final question here for you.
I didn't try and get quotes, but I've talked to each of those figures over the years. So I didn't go down the route of, trying to interview them for the book, but I think it's fair to say that I'm familiar with their thinking about these issues.
Got it. So that's a good turning point to our fourth question, which is the ultra-competitive race for supremacy with regard to the future of money, payments, geopolitics. Is the United States government and the Fed at risk of losing control because of these new developments that you highlight in the book?
Well, that's the concern. Now, I realize it sounds kind of apoplectic to say, the US dollar might not be the global reserve currency anymore. And I'm not saying that's going to happen tomorrow afternoon or anything. Although, various things that the Trump administration are currently doing are, maybe making that more likely, still not tomorrow afternoon, but putting the status of the US dollar more at risk. What I'm really focused on here is what happens in terms of competition with private currencies and with other government currencies. So, Facebook and Libra is an example of what happens if they had gotten off the ground as a private digital currency. And they had put together a coalition with like Visa and MasterCard and a bunch of other big companies, financial services and non-financial services. And they had the potential to have a very, very large instant installed user base. And
So
if you
this was
think
not gonna just be like a joke meme coin. This was the real
this
deal.
this was not going to be a meme coin. This wasn't millennia coin. This was like a
Yeah.
real thing. And people could use it to transact. That was the whole purpose. And, in some sense, there was a somewhat noble purpose of Libra, which was to help bank the unbanked around the world, particularly in, say, sub-Saharan Africa, and give people a way of storing the value that comes from their labor in a way that's currently quite hard for them. But I worried about the not so noble aspects of it in terms of the control it would give Facebook over large chunks of the world's economy. Now, that's the private side. Now, okay, the Libra experiment was abandoned, but I talk about in the book, it's totally plausible that Amazon could try and do the same thing, or Apple, or another one of these companies that has a very, very large installed user base, and could start it off by saying, if you're a buyer or a seller on Amazon, let's have, I have a little bit of fun with it and call it Bezos bucks or something like that. But,
Yeah.
you could imagine them sort of doing that, and then that's its own kind of quite large economy, and you could expand from there. And so that's on the private side, and there are other companies, Google, Apple, other companies that could potentially do this. And then on the government side, I think most people would be surprised by how far down the track China is with what they call the ECNY, the digital yuan, if you like. They're not piloting that, they're rolling it out. They are making that a completely one-for-one alternative currency to the traditional yuan across basically all of China. And I think that if that gets a foothold, then firstly, China's a pretty big economy. Secondly, if they go down the path of showing what you can do with some of the smart contract Web3 stuff by running it on their platform, the transaction cost might be very low, and people who want to do DeFi and use smart contracts and programmable money and run decentralized autonomous organizations, so-called DAOs, they might use the ECNY to do that. You can't do it in a practical way with Ethereum, but you could do it in a practical way with the Chinese digital currency. And I worry that if Europe or the United States doesn't stand up their own digital currency, then that's going to be a really big problem.
That's potentially a scary future, whether it's the private currencies or other government currencies. Final 30 seconds here. Is your thesis or your book, do you believe that it's working in terms of the policymakers in America wanting to roll out their own Fed coin?
No, don't. Now, maybe it was always a bit of a forlorn hope because, there are a lot of people in America who are very opposed to government playing a significant role in society. It's a kind of more libertarian society than, say, parts of continental Europe or even countries like Australia, which are maybe somewhere in between. And so maybe it was always difficult. I think, President Trump is super pro crypto, and it's probably getting even less likely to occur. Although I think an intriguing possibility is in terms of the sort of make America great again thing that motivates the president, as far as I can tell. The idea of China being the world leader in a global digital currency is something that I imagine would kind of rankle the president. And so maybe there's a chance that he's the guy that decides to create a central bank digital currency. I'd kind of be surprised, but to be honest, I think it's more likely to occur under a Trump presidency than under, say, it was under a Biden or a Kamala Harris presidency.
I think that's a good segue to our final question here, which is you're making a number of recommendations that you believe will ensure growth, stability, and inclusion. Can you walk us through some of these and their importance moving forward?
Well, what I really advocate for here is for the US government creating this thing I call FedCoin, a central bank digital currency. And then I basically sort of trace through what the implications of doing that would be. So, one of them would be take a country, you could think of Australia, but take a country like Japan. What would happen if the US created a central bank digital currency? And, it's sort of international by its very nature. So what if there were no restrictions and anyone could get a wallet app on their phone and then say, convenience stores in Japan and, ride hailing services and taxis and so on decided to take that digital currency as payment? you'd effectively suddenly have people using US dollars in Japan. And that's not at all impossible. And I was struck by just my own experience on my own university campus here at UNSW in Sydney, where we have a good number, more than 10,000 foreign students. Quite a lot of those students are from mainland China. So a number of our outlets on campus take WeChat Pay and Alipay because students want to use that. And I was just struck by the fact that currencies can cross boundaries now. Now, if I show up at the local coffee place here down the bottom of my building below my office with US dollars, they're not going to take it. And
Like,
if I show up with yen or with yuan, they're not going to take those banknotes. But
hmm,
of course, digital currencies suddenly allow that to be slickly integrated into the payment system. And so I thought about what would happen if FedCoin really happened? What would that mean for Japan? And the concern would be that they would lose control of their kind of monetary autonomy. And so the US government would need to, and I think should want to, protect them from that. So then you get into things like, okay, do you do region coding or something like, akin to, I'm old enough to remember when DVDs, one, existed, but two, had these region codes. So if I got a DVD in Australia, I couldn't go play that on a US DVD player or a Japanese DVD player. And that was a way of trying to, well, it was kind of monopolistic in a way, but you could imagine a good version of that here. So I just traced through what those implications would be for the global economy in the design of FedCoin. And then there's the internal stuff. So just very quickly, it would potentially create a lot of upheaval with the commercial banking system in the United States. Again, people who aren't kind of into financial economics or monetary economics may not appreciate that when the commercial banks around the world, but just take in the United States, a bank like Wells Fargo or Bank of America, it actually creates credit, it creates money, and it
yeah.
earns money from that. So when it issues you with a home loan for a $500,000, it really creates potentially $500,000 of new money when it does that. And if you had a tokenized currency for the US dollar, that role would go away and you'd have to make sure that the whole banking system didn't collapse. So I kind of work through how one might be careful about that.
And your book does such a great job of being very clear of the steps and the thinking of why you are advocating for this.
Well,
And
thank you.
again, I would agree with you, which is it is important. So, final 30 seconds here. What is your thoughts? What is it, 18 months later since the book came out? 12 months? How long has it been now?
Yeah, it's a little over 12 months now. Yeah.
Okay, and I don't want to ask about the reception because I know the reception's been great, but what of the developments since, the book has been out with Trump being in power, with global changes, right?
Well, I think Trump's the big one. So on the one hand, he seems like a big fan of crypto for a variety of reasons. He had a lot of campaign supporters who were pro crypto during the campaign. He's made some money, at least on paper, out of issuing his own meme coin. You could imagine him being very pro crypto, but as I was alluding to earlier or mentioning earlier, you could also imagine him thinking that what China's doing is something that he wants to kind of put a stop to. So I think it's kind of an open question as to which of those two sides of the Trump ledger end up dominating. And, sort of US power versus, maybe personal wealth. Perhaps they're not mutually exclusive. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. I think on the just crypto side itself, it's become bigger. One of the things that's happened since I wrote the book is that there have become Bitcoin ETFs, exchange traded funds that like BlackRock and JP Morgan have established. So some of the big conventional mainstream financial institutions in the world are kind of facilitating people getting into crypto. And so that presents its own challenges, but also opportunities.
Okay, great. That is our 5 questions for you, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us here on Books in 5. You did an amazing job answering our questions. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And now we have just a few more questions for you, and we'll try to get through them in another 5 minutes, but we'll keep it short. Is how did you become an economist and a professor? What is your life story to get to that point?
A little bit of an accident. It goes back to a class on American economic history in my second year as an undergraduate at the University of Sydney, quite a while ago now. My parents didn't go to university. I was the eldest child in my family. I didn't have a lot of kind of role models of people going to university. I didn't know anyone who was a professor of anything. I kind of maybe not bumbled through my first year, but I maybe wasn't the best student in the history of the University of Sydney in my first year. I took this class in the second half of my second year at the University of Sydney with a guy who was dean of the faculty, had a Harvard PhD in economics. His name was Stephen Salisbury. He passed away some time ago, but he had a huge impact on me. And he said to me, like, have you ever thought about, you're a good student, you should think about going and doing a PhD and being an academic. And I didn't know what that looked like. And he kind of encouraged me in that direction. And it's the age-old story of like one really important teacher, one really important instructor, in my case, professor and dean. It changed my life, opened my eyes to these things. And, I went and ended up, I guess, in some way following in his footsteps. I did a PhD at Harvard and, got a job at MIT and then the University of Chicago. And now I'm back in Australia at UNSW. And, I love it. I found my calling.
You're enjoying it over there, right? Yeah. Are you planning to stay in Australia and maybe be a role model for other economic students to follow in your footsteps now?
I don't know about being a role model, but I think one of the great things about how global the economics profession is that, I can, present my research and publish my research in the best places internationally and still be part of that global economics community, sort of academic economics community. But at the same time, I can, it's too highfalutin and over the top to talk about being a public intellectual, but I can play a role in talking about ideas in the media and in Australian society more broadly. And I'm from Australia. I love Australia. And being able to play a role in that is something that I wouldn't be able to do realistically in the United States. And I can do here. And it's something that matters to me. And I try and make my second contribution in that sphere, in that domain.
I was going to ask you what's your proudest accomplishment. I think that answer that you just gave answers it, which is, guiding future students into economics and understanding of how finance and the world works. So my last question for you here is, what are you working on next?
I am working on theoretical models of human cognition. So trying to get inside people's heads and understand how people think and do that in a way that we can do basic economics with it. So there's been a revolution in behavioral economics that people like Kahneman and Tversky and my pal Richard Thaler pioneered and have done amazing things with that. That has influenced economics a lot, but if you open up an economics textbook, whether it be a PhD textbook or a first-year undergraduate principles textbook, it's mentioned in a chapter somewhere maybe, but it's not incorporated into the basic economic models of consumer choice, producer theory, how firms exist. And I and my co-authors, Robert Akerlof and Hongi Lee, are trying to develop a framework for being able to do that. It's not a modest project. It's very ambitious. It may well not work, but that's what tenure's for. You get to have a swing at things. So that's what I'm working on.
Exciting, challenging, and necessary for the next few decades of life on this planet, right?
We'll see how it goes.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Richard. This is Books in 5. The host of Books in 5 is Bhavan Sodhan. Books in 5 is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.